Hello, welcome to week 5, Portland State University History 322U. This week's talk is about the Chinese Revolution and the defeat of Japan. It's in 2 parts. That is, the PowerPoint comes in 2 files, and I believe we'll be doing 2 audio uploads for this part 1. I've made some progress with the technical issues and believe that this may be the last week that we have to do a YouTube upload, but we'll see. A supposedly new technical trick is in the offing. So if we go to PowerPoint now, that's here on D2L, and continue on past slide 2 to slide 3. First, I want to note that, unfortunately, there's a bit of a difference between the romanization that's used in our different texts. There's an old-style romanization. I won't bore you with all the details, but there's an old-style romanization in one of the books, and the new style that the communists used beginning in 1955 or so, and that has become the one that is most prevalent and is used in most textbooks. So, for example, if you look in the middle of this slide, number 3, Mao Zedong, the first Mao Zedong with a T in the middle there, that's the old style. And the second one, Mao Zedong with a Z or a Z in the middle, that's the new style, which is called pinyin. So, I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but I just wanted to give you a table you can refer to. I picked out as many as I could fit onto one sheet of the different names and so on that appear, along with some abbreviations, in the hopes that this makes the whole thing less confusing. Let's go on to slide 4. Another thing that can be confusing when people first start learning about this topic is all these names that are given to the different Chinese revolutions and wars in the first half of the 20th century. So in front there, at the first bullet, you see the Xinhai Revolution. Usually this is just referred to as the 1911 revolution, when the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, ended and the Republic of China formally began, but we'll get into how messy that is as we go along. The Chinese Revolution is one thing, but the Chinese Communist Revolution is quite another. I think the slide explains that. The Anti-Japanese War is yet another thing. The Pacific War is yet another thing, and the Chinese Civil War is what followed World War II. So that's all self-explanatory, I think. Let's go on to slide 5. In the 1911 revolution, was a surprise to everyone. I think you can see in the textbook that the Westad reading that nobody expected the dynasty to fall. Everybody knew it was in trouble, but no one expected a sudden collapse, at least in historical terms, sudden collapse that came about. And as explained in the text, what happened was that there was a outbreak of violence in Wuhan, in central China, which led to the garrison there having to make a hard choice. They thought that it was either their lives or a rebellion, and they decided on a rebellion. And then within 30 days, large numbers of localities had decided to join in this rebellion. However, again, these changes are never instantaneous. You can see from this map that things took a while, and that one section in the north remained loyal, and that section in the north, very large region, which included Peking or Beijing, eventually broke away from the old Qing dynasty, and really the Qing dynasty lasted, one could say, until 1912, when Yuan Shikai decided to side with the Republic, at least in name, but that's really all it was, just in name, and throw the emperor out of the Forbidden City. And so then he ended up going into, let's go to slide 6. Yuan Shikai, we learned about him last week. He had distinguished himself in Korea, and either was very lucky or very clever. I'm not quite sure myself which one it was, but he avoided command during the disastrous Sino-Japanese War. He was around during the period when he could do some good for the empire, between 1885 and 1894, and he was able to dominate the Korean court and bring Korea back under the very firm sway of the Qing dynasty. And this is something to remember, that the Qing, the Manchu dynasty, had an awful lot of fight left in it in its last days. By no means was it tottering on collapse for decades. Something to remember when you consider today's situations. The processes of history are quite often very surprising. He had built himself a loyalty network of officers he promoted, very similar to today, too, in the political processes of the People's Republic. The way people build up pyramids of support below themselves is that they promote and therefore enrich their subordinates, who therefore owe them loyalty. This works very differently in their system than it does in ours. There's much more emphasis even today on personal loyalty, and this was certainly true back then. So he had his network of people who were ready to rally to his side in 1912 and then 1913, right after elections were held that seemed to elect the Republican leaders, including Sun Yat-sen and others, who we'll get to in a moment. And Yuan Shikai basically nullified those elections by force and arranged the assassination of a key figure named Song, who we'll get to in a couple slides, and was able to take control of that part of the country. Now, the foreign powers, who had a lot of power at this point in history, didn't mind this one bit, because what they were looking for was stability to guarantee that business could go on. This was not only the British, the Americans, the French, the Germans, it included the Japanese, certainly. Everybody wanted stability so they could continue to do what they were doing, which was buying and selling in China, with the idea that eventually China would become a huge market, something that eventually did come true, albeit not right away. When Japan made its 21 demands, he initially yielded to them. Let's go on to slide 7. We'll talk about that a little bit. To establish what, in essence, would have been a Japanese protectorate over China, seeking total control of the coastal ports, so that the Japanese could basically slowly take over from all the foreign powers and allow for Japanese suzerainty throughout the country. However, the British were in no mood to grant Japan that kind of power in China, where it was the most powerful imperialist in the neighborhood. And so the British, the Americans, and others got together and reined in Japan's moves in their direction of the 21 demands, and basically put everything off until the Versailles Conference in 1919 at the end of the war. There was compromise on the way to this because the Allies wanted Japan technically in the war and on their side, although in the end, certainly there was no gain for the Allies in Europe, anyway, by having the Japanese on their side, no appreciable gain. At the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, again, there were compromises, and the territories that had belonged to Germany, which the Chinese delegation expected would be returned to them, since China was also on the Allied side and actually did more for the Allies in Europe than did the Japanese by sending thousands of laborers, many of whom were killed in the trenches in Europe, to work for the Allies in the European theater. So the Allies decided in a realpolitik move to award German concessions in China to Japan, and not give them full control over vast portions of the country, just to give them what Germany had. And this caused tremendous outrage and led to the May 4th demonstrations in Beijing, and the May 4th, what became known as the May 4th movement. Let's go on to slide 8. Leading up to this time, the most well-known, even if he was relatively powerless, leader in the Nationalist Party that had started inside and outside China was Sun Yat-sen, also known as Sun Zhongshan. He was and still is, at least on Taiwan, referred to as the father of the nation, or the Guofu. He had been educated in the U.S. and China. There's even some information indicating there's some conflict, or rather controversy over where he was really born. Educated in the U.S. and China, and began his anti-Manchu organizing in Guangdong. But he spent a long time overseas raising funds in various places, including the U.S. and Japan and Southeast Asia. If you travel, for example, to Penang in Malaysia, there is, in the old Georgetown area of Penang, there's a Sun Yat-sen library, which is a very interesting place to visit. There's a similar facility in Honolulu, as I recall, and you'll find that his fundraising went all over the place. There was one point where he was actually kidnapped in London 10 years before this. I think it was 1898 or 1897. An agent of the Qing government lured him into the Chinese embassy. I don't know why on earth he would allow himself to do that, but that's what he did. And then he was detained, and he ended up, he had friends in London. He ended up convincing one of the local people who worked as a servant inside an English woman to smuggle out a note to his friend, a physician in London, who then contacted various people, ended up having to go to the press because the British government didn't want to have anything to do with it, with rescuing somebody from the Chinese mission. But it ended up that he was released. So he was well known as an enemy of the Qing. And he was out of the country when the 1911 revolution occurred, so he immediately returned, participated in elections that followed a year and a half later that were reversed by the military, as we talked about a moment ago, and then began a long struggle to establish a base and to continue the struggle against what amounted to warlords as time went on, to establish a national government. In 1924, he was offered assistance by the new nation, the Soviet Union, which was seeking to counter Japanese influence in China, because their concern was that if Japan became powerful enough in East Asia, then they would turn toward Russia. And indeed, this was part of the plan of some of the nationalist, extreme nationalist elements, the right-wing elements in Japan that became active in the following decades, was to turn north and to take away parts of Siberia, or the Russian Far East, from the Soviet Union. Sun Yat-sen founded the movement that eventually took over most of the country, but he died before it really got anywhere and never saw it come to fruition. He helped to plan the Northern Expedition that followed a year after his death. He's sometimes compared to Lenin as the father of a revolution who, if only he had lived, it might have gone differently and this sort of thing, but I don't think there's much comparison there. Lenin was quite a different figure with very different ideas about how to control the country and no democratic impulse at all. Sun Yat-sen was not the perfect democrat either, but he was oriented toward representative government. I'm going to stop here and go on to slide 9 in the next audio recording.